So what is communication? I mean, it's a competency that we see on every leadership.
Wait. That's the provocative question? That's the provocative question?
Well, let's start over then. Well, I'm going to lead into Kimberly's bad communication story. Get ready, Kimberly. We're going to start over again.
Oh, you're going to love this.
Everyone's a freaking critic. All right.
This is the show. This is the whole thing.
Take two. All right. Bad leadership story. Oh, man.
Sense Signal podcast with Dan and Jodah in 3.
It is
We
Friday.
don't grab them in the first 5 seconons. We lose them.
Yeah, hey,
And this is an example of perfect communication right here.
Right. All right, everybody. Today we're talking about communication on the Sense and Signal podcast with Dan and Jodah. We're here welcoming two former guests, Kimberly Benoit and Jesan Sorrells, both leadership coaches, consultants, and experts in the field of organizational leadership, and authors. And we are proud to have them here to tell us about some terrible communication stories involving leadership. So, Kimberly, you said you had a good one, so I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so prepare yourselves. So I was a brand new employee at a hospital. I had not worked in healthcare before, and they had brought me in. I was hired as like a program manager. So I was shadowing somebody because I needed to learn kind of what I was going to be doing and the people I was going to be working with. And I walk into this meeting and it's got doctors in it and administrators, and they start talking about the challenges they're facing with the ED and how we really need to get the budget and we need to add some budget and we're going to be bringing in some specialists and all this stuff. And I am sitting there thoroughly confused, or should I say amazed, because I kept thinking to myself, I had no idea that erectile dysfunction had its own department. And that it was such a big problem. Like, you see the commercials on TV, but like, really? Like, it has its own separate, like, it's a diagnosis and it has its own, it's not like cancer. Like, you don't die from it. And so I'm sitting there just like making notes, and I'm like, wow, I really underestimated this. You know, we've made jokes about this, like the specialist. So good thing I did not say a word, because after we were done, I asked my training partner who had brought me along, and I said to them, I had no idea that erectile dysfunction was such a problem. And first off, she choked and started laughing so hard that she couldn't speak for about 5 minutes. And then she said, Kim, it's not erectile dysfunction. It's the emergency department. And I said, what? And I said, you mean the emergency room? She's like, the ER. And she's like, no, Kim, the emergency room is a function of the emergency department. So you thought the whole time they were talking about erectile dysfunction? And I said, well, yeah. Like, why wouldn't I think that? Everything you hear is ED, 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 ED. That's the only association I have with it. She's like, oh God. So then she proceeded to tell everybody that I thought it was erectile dysfunction. Moral of the story is that was how I met most of the new people that I was working with, is because I became the ED girl. You can never make assumptions. One, are you using jargon? Are you using acronyms? Are you even sure that people know what you're talking about? And like, in my mind, that is a prime example of where communication just goes completely wrong. Everybody in that room thought they were all speaking the same language. I was in a completely different place. And so just for all of you out there, anyone, if you should move into healthcare and you hear the, acronym ED, it's not erectile dysfunction. Learn from my mistake.
Although this reminds me of a story Jodah and I were talking about recently with a foreign exchange student that we went to college with from Japan. Do you remember that story, Jodah?
It's sort of related. It's more of a foreign language issue. But But sticking with this jargon thing, it's interesting. There's two things I can think of when you're communicating with jargon. I am.
Basically,
wait. So it's essentially, we'll tell at the end if there's time. It's funny, but it's kind of not.
He does this on shows. He says he's going to tell a story at the end of the show, and then we never get to it. And then I'm editing, and I'm like,
where was the story?
Jodah never finished the story.
I'm sensing a strategy here.
There is a strategy, yes. But as far as the jargon is concerned, I feel like we're talking about communication, and we'll talk about probably different levels of communication. There's intended communication. There's also the communication that you unintendedly send out. But this notion of jargon is interesting because it is the sort of the Malcolm McLuhan, is that his name? The media is the message guy. What's his name?
Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah. It's really not the jargon that you're signaling when people use jargon. It's the fact that you're using jargon. It signals to people, I'm in this group and look how cool I am. And other people, I'm cool too. I got that jargon as well. And it can be leveraged in a way that can definitely keep people from feeling they're part of the system or network. And so it's not even literally the words, it's the impetus of the words.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that's something I'm onboarding some new employees right now who aren't from higher education. So I do take the time, and I think this is my role as a leader, is do you understand what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to define these acronyms to make sure? And they're like, no, I don't, because they're not going to say anything unless you check with them, because they don't want to feel like the person on the outside of the group. So taking the time to pause and go, do you understand what we're talking about? And catching them up is important.
Well, and most jargon is, let's be frank here, most jargon is BS. I mean, you're not going to wind up holding your partner's hand in two tubs together, on a Cialis commercial. If you, which is the first thing, by the way, Kimberly, that popped into my head when you said ED.
Thank you.
You're probably you're probably not going to wind up in that spot, right? That's going to create all other kinds of uncomfortabilities. But the key thing in remembering the issue of jargon is, if you cannot explain it, and this is how I always frame it for leaders, if you can't explain what you want done to a 5-year-old, what are you doing? You're hiding behind jargon. You're using it as a cover or as a camouflage. And to Jodah's point, using it, I find a lot of leaders use it for ego stroking, and that's probably something we could do without.
Sometimes you just, I'd push back on that a little bit. Like, maybe there's some ego stroking going on. Like, I have this knowledge that you don't have access to, but I also think it's cultural. You're swimming in your own pond, and you're forgetting that, there are new people coming into the pond that are not going to be familiar with these things that you say casually because you're so immersed in the culture of the organization.
Well, I think that's true. And especially when you speak about industry. So, because I've worked in so many different industries, like retail had its own things. It had its own, acronyms and its own jargon. Healthcare has a tremendous, you're stepping into almost a completely different planet. And I think that's the component about leadership that's most important is, are you doing a good job of slowing down and asking in a non-condescending way? Because I think that's another thing too, is you have to be able to check for, and that's where I think communication falls off, is do you check for understanding and do it in a way that is not condescending and meaningful to ensure that, we're all saying the same things, we're aligning on message. Because, ED aside, there's many times people will use words that may sound the same, but have very different meanings to people depending on your team, your department, even within the same company. I've seen that fall off the rails sometimes, where people walk away with and you can talk they were all in the same meeting, but boy, we all had very different ideas of what the next steps were, because we understood different things. And so that's the component I always feel is, one, how do you keep it simple? And are you confirming and checking for understanding as you go? Because that's a newbie mistake. I sent the email. Okay. That was an email. And did they read it?
And advocating for yourself too. If you're the new person in the organization, I'm thinking about a very specific person who, when we're at meetings, will stop the meeting and say, "Can you define what you just said?" Because they haven't been in the industry that long. So also making sure that you're taking that role too, and clarifying information for yourself. which is a risk because people can make judgments about you, and it might be me.
I think it's important for people to take advantage of being the new person in the room. I think we often think we're the new person, so I don't have anything to say. I don't know well enough to bring up a question. That's the perfect time to be stupid, and lean into it. If you're with a group who's going to take advantage of you because of that, wrong group to be with. That's not people you want to be working with in the first place, because that's my bread and butter. I get sad when I become the person who people look to answer sometimes, because I get to stop. I feel like I'm not empowered to ask the stupid questions anymore. So I think it's important to definitely take advantage of that newbie point in any sort of situation for that purpose.
Well, I think you probably have about 6 to 8 months when you're in that first initial sort of getting into the team. I call it the dating period, right? Like before you enter an intimate relationship, you're dating, right? This is the area where we're finding out about each other, where we're discovering what the meaning of things are. It's all very romantic and all that other kind of good stuff. And people don't like talking about love stories at work, by the way, but this is part of the stories that we tell, which is of course a part of communication. But it is a love story at work. This is how we fall in love with work. We fall in love with the job. And it does, psychologically speaking, it does take around 6 to 8 months for an individual to feel as though they are part of that team. And one of the key ways that we figure that out is through asking questions, right? There are no stupid questions. I would, at least not in that period, there aren't. And quite frankly, as you transition in your career, one of the things sometimes I've worked with folks who are in career transitions is when you take that next step up in promotion, or you take that next transition in your career, or you maybe move laterally into another role that might be in the same space, you get a new fresh 6 to 8 months. So don't dismiss that. Use that time to grow your knowledge base.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, for sure.
I tell people it takes you about 6 months to actually learn your job. Like, do you know the ins and out? And it takes about at least 9 months to learn the unspoken stuff. So like the stuff on paper is about 6, and the unspoken stuff is about 9.
Oh, I like that.
And because it's the that untouchable, indefinable culture. Like, who really is the power player in the room? Like, okay, their titles, awesome, but who actually is the decision maker? Who is the one that is driving what's happening here? And one of the things that I think we haven't talked about yet, because we've talked a lot about words, but is the importance of communication through nonverbal signals. Because when somebody's lost. So is that because usually there's a blank expression that eventually, because I can only imagine the expression I had on my face in that meeting of like, I'm sure I looked confused. So gratefully nobody asked me, because I don't think that meeting could have continued with all of those people realizing what I thought was being discussed. But the idea of saying, if somebody looks lost, they probably are. And, how are we cueing into the stuff that isn't being spoken, but the stuff that is nonverbal and how somebody is physically presenting? And it's different virtually than it is in person, but you can still read, if you're paying attention, when somebody is not with you or tracking with what's going on.
And what would be some of the nonverbal cues that you'd look for in that situation? I mean, the blank expression.
Well,
for sure.
I would. The blank middle distance stare. Yeah,
I've been working with Jodah for almost a year now, and I still get that expression from him.
Deer in headlights.
I was going to say, I wish people would stop asking me if I'm confused.
We're just checking in on you, Jodah. We just want to see how you are. That's all.
Is your screen just frozen, or is that your face?
No, I'm just confused. Admit it.
No, I think we do. I think we look for the middle distance staring off kind of. I don't really know what's going on here. I also think we need to look for because the body tells the story, like in trauma. Same thing with confusion, right? So if you're really tied into your team, who's shuffling papers, who seems to be scribbling furiously, whom seems to be nodding, but they've got a fixed smile on their face because they're going to have another meeting outside where they're going to figure all this out. Those are some of the nonverbals that you want to be looking for, particularly in a group setting where the real power of social proofing doesn't allow people to have to ask questions.
Okay, so now I have to practice what we're preaching here. Hey, son, what is social proofing?
Social proofing is this great aspect of persuasion. It's actually, if you go and look at Robert Cialdini's work on persuasion, it's the third spot in his pyramid after commitment and consistency and reciprocity. And social proofing is basically the idea that we do what other people do because it seems correct, not right or wrong, not a value word. It seems correct. So if it's correct for everybody to be rowing in this particular direction, it's really hard for us to be the outlier because human beings like being part of teams. They like being part of, I'm going to use a loaded word here that Seth Godin would use. People like being a part of tribes. We like being in the in group rather than in the out group, right? And it takes a lot of courage, by the way. This is why we call them rebels and iconoclasts, to be in that out group. It takes a lot of courage. But in a work situation, the penalties for being in an out group are so much higher. And particularly if we're new, we don't know what the penalties are. So we're not going to be psychologically oriented to take that risk. Thus, the social proofing is very strong, or the power of that social proofing is very strong to just pull us along, even if we have no idea where we're going.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I feel like I always feel like a little bit of an outlier in the workspace. Just naturally, right? I mean, what about you, Kimberly? Like when you're thinking about trying to adapt to an organization, what are things that you have done to help yourself belong, or do you feel like you want to stand aside and not get caught up in that rowing?
Well, I think I agree completely with Hasan. Like you don't know what you don't know, and over experience has taught you, if you come in and you stick your foot in it, then you're not starting from a level playing field. You're now digging out of a hole that you don't even know how deep it is, because you're not sure who you've upset. You're not sure who you've ticked off. I've made that mistake where I came in and I was operating on my prior company's culture and expectations, and that was not what my new company was, and I ended up upsetting the wrong person. And I was so confused. Yep. I had no idea what I had done, because in my mind, social proofing, I was rowing the boat, but I was rowing the boat for a different company. And so I think what I usually advise people to do, and one of the things I encourage leaders to do, is buddy somebody up. So you get like an onboarding buddy or something. Like that's the person you talk to. Yeah, but make it a peer. So like somebody who's close that you can phone a friend and be like, hey, what's this ED thing? I just want to make sure I got that right. Or, hey, I was in this meeting and they kept using these acronyms. I don't know what those mean. And I don't know where to go find what that means. And so you create that safe space, or to have the conversations of like, hey, I was in this meeting and this person was in there and this person was in there, and I picked up on some stuff. Can you help me understand? So how to help so that you don't stick your foot in it? How do you help buddy somebody up so that they can have a safe space to ask those questions in that 6-month period of be stupid? So maybe it's not appropriate to ask it in the moment, but where's a safe place to say, I don't know what I'm doing, or I feel like that I'm about to make a mistake, or is this the right way to approach it here?
I think
as you start figuring it out.
Super smart, because I think there's a tension there when you're starting a new job or coming into a new position where you have this expectation like, oh, they want me to do something with this job and take initiative and create change. But at the same time, to do that, there's a potential you're going to step on some people's toes. And I think we've all been in that situation where you're like, okay, I got this great idea, I'm putting it forward, and then it's like, sit down, kid. We've already done that, or that's my thing, and you're stepping out of you're veering off of your pathway.
Well, I also think there's a responsibility, and I'm glad Kimberly mentioned this, about on the culture to provide that peer mentoring, right? And I would even use the word mentoring, because mentoring's loaded. I would use the term coaching, right? Peer-to-peer coaching, right? And setting up that relationship. And it's really interesting. So, in addition to everything else that I do, I'm also an amateur historian, particularly on the history of work. And so the history of work is very much, particularly in America, based off of, obviously, the Henry Ford industrialization model, just taken everywhere to its logical conclusion. And inside of that model, there are certain assumptions about the people that are coming in to the model and how they're going to behave. And many of us, we haven't quite made the full generational transition over. I think we will in the next 15 years as the much talked about Generation Z begins to rise into middle management. They'll be the first generation that didn't really come up under industrial.
Don't scare me, Jesan.
Well, they're the first generation that didn't come up under industrialization. So here we go. But we still have enough people left in the system who remember that industrial model, right? And remember the leftovers of that industrial model. And part of that industrial model is based off of the assumption that there are certain shared experiences, shared culture, shared whatever that bind us together even before we show up to work. So there shouldn't need to be a coach. There shouldn't need to be a mentor because we all just naturally share this. Again, assumptions are dangerous. And those assumptions have not been true for at least the last 25, 30 years. But organizations are slow typically to catch on to this.
Interesting.
So so to steer back to communication too, what is an example? Do you have an example, Jesan, of a really bad communication story from a organization that you've been involved with?
Oh my, yes. So worked with an organization, and this can be framed in so many different ways, but I had a client who called me and I would have never done this work if they hadn't already been a client that was referred to me by another one, right? So I trusted the client that sent the referral, and thus I took this client's call. And so they called me and they said, "Hey, we've got a vice president here." And I said, "Okay, that's interesting. What's the problem with the vice president?" They said, "Well, in meetings, he has a problem with communication." And I said, "Okay, what's the issue with communication?" And they said, "Well, he's making jokes and calling people Aunt Jemima and thinking that it's funny." Now, there are usually times, and this has only happened a couple times in my career as a consultant and as a trainer and as an educator, where I pause the interaction, I put someone on mute, I turn off the video if I happen to be on Zoom, and I just laugh out loud, or I go, "What just happened?" or something. It's only been a couple of times. And that was one of those times in my career where I literally it was on a Zoom call, literally put the person on mute. I said, "Hold on a second." And I muted them and I muted the video. And I sat in this very same office that I'm sitting in now. And I said, "What the hell?" Because this was 2021.
Wow.
Small manufacturing company, vice president, been there from the beginning, just thought it was a big joke, da-da-da-da-da. Now, again, that operates on so many different levels, but let's just focus on the communication piece. Because let's just focus on the tiny part here. If you're having meetings and you're a person who's supposed to be the leader and supposed to be in charge, you're the one who sets the tone for those meetings. And so I understand humor, I understand jokes. But we have to, well, for anybody listening to the Census Signal podcast, the big piece of advice out of there, if you are a leader, is read the room, people. Right. You have to know the culture of the room you're in.
Don't know how to read a room.
That's true. They do not. I agree with that. Yes.
And I think, because I think we are good at that. And because we do it, I think we assume people know. Like this random thought, I have never seen a training on teaching people to read body language, like in a speaking capacity. Like, how do you know how to read if you have just made someone very uncomfortable? Now, granted, does this VP care about changing his behavior? Because that's a component that we're not even brought in. Because if he doesn't care, then you can coach him all you want. You can train him all you want. And he's still going to think his joke is funny and want to say his joke no matter what. Right. So that's a separate problem.
As the CEO says, either go to this diversity training or go to this communication training or you're out, right?
That makes me think I have a provocative question. What is communication? I'm just kidding, Dan. But the question,
what is it?
What is no? But it does.
That's a good question.
It does bring up the notion, though, right? I mean, when we're communicating, we are. And what is the point of sending signals out? And one of the signals that person might have been signaling out was that like we said, I don't care. There could be a hubris to their personality, but that's the vibe I get from that story. Is this person kind of what Kimberly was kind of leading to at that last question, is that he wants to be known as this person that I'm tough and I can say things and I'm going to offend you and you better live with it. In fact, one of the things that Dan and I one of the episodes we just had, and I brought this so many times now. I read this Harvard Business Review study around teams, and the research of this one said they could tell when a team was going to be successful, not by the smartest people on the team or what they said or the great ideas that they shared, but how they communicated. So much in communication is really sits back on the sort of the lizard or monkey brain side, the primitive aspects, something to think about, and I don't even know what you're supposed to do with that information, but just to know that we're sort of touchy feely really when it comes to communication, more so than using this part up here that we think we're leveraging.
Well, one of my favorite sayings about communication is it's the illusion that it's actually happened. And so, so for instance, during COVID, because I was still working for a health system at the time, and, we had to do some emergency communication training because we were pushing out a lot of very unpleasant policies and things that people were very resistant to. And what we found were that some leaders who were scared to tell their teams that they had to be the bearers of some news that weren't great related to some policy changes. And so they would just send an email and they would but I communicated it. Or they would send it in a text message. And so those kinds of things is the idea. And now granted, I think some of these people were intentionally deluding themselves, but I also think we have an issue now, especially when you look generationally, that certain people like to receive communication in a certain way and they have go-to communication styles. Like I know some people who will never answer a phone, but some messages
He doesn't. Never does.
But some messages need to be delivered via conversation versus some messages are more appropriate for a text message or an IM or my favorite was recently I was working with somebody who was like, nobody uses email anymore. And I thought, yeah, they do. Maybe I'm just really old.
Oh.
But again, depending on the message, you have to think about the kind of communication needed.
So remember the story that floated to the top of your LinkedIn news feed? If it's on desktop, it's on the right hand side of your news feed. If you are on mobile on LinkedIn, it's actually in your feed. But remember the story that popped up? I believe it was in 2021, where the gentleman who was the CEO of an organization, I can't remember which one. It probably doesn't matter, but it's to Kimberly's point. He fired 800 people via Zoom. I remember that.
Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, beyond just the bad leadership there, which he, by the way, he owed it to his employees to have 800 separate meetings.
Yeah.
With each one of them, if you're going to fire them via Zoom, which is fine, by the way, if we're in the middle of a pandemic and you've got to do it remotely, but it's on you as the leader to have 800 separate meetings. And by the way, all the people who are now listening to the podcast who are leaders, they now passed out. So I just killed your entire subscriber base.
Well,
because
but in the first 10 seconds anyhow.
but it's true,
Yeah.
right? Like if we're going to deliver hard messages, to Kimberly's point, we have to be able to critically think about how those messages are going to be received by the other person, because there's always two people in a communication interaction. But then also the tool we use to deliver that message also sends a message as part of the communication. And so when you're firing 800 people anonymously via Zoom, or God help us, via text message, which that will come up fairly soon, I suspect, or via a TikTok video.
Right.
The medium, to go back to Marshall McLuhan for just a minute, is also, it continues to be the message.
It'll be
right?
a TikTok video with a dance.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah.
With some choreographed
Fired.
dance. No severance.
Pick up your check.
All right, we're gonna have to make that as a joke thing now.
But it's true. But that I think is
on TikTok.
I think this challenge though becomes the more methods of communication, the more means that we have. And again, people really gravitate to the one they love the most.
Yep.
When you are a leader, though, that you have to pump the brakes on that and say, what does the message require for there to actually be communication and for me to truly check for understanding? And, and sometimes it's going to, one message may have to have multiple methods of communication.
Oh yeah, I'm leading a change at my institution right now where people will potentially lose their jobs, and it's due to a state policy change. And we've had meetings, we've had emails, again, to your point, multiple methods of communication about these changes that will impact their jobs. So even in person, not necessarily in person, but one-on-one Zoom meetings to kind of talk people through, like, this is why this is happening, help them make sense of the situation, and so forth. So I definitely believe that. And to your point, Kimberly, about the challenge of the multiple methods, I find in my organization, we have people who only respond through email, people who will only respond through Teams, people will only respond if you go to their office and have that hallway conversation. True. And so now you have to learn, like, okay, if I want something from this person, this is how I have to do it. If I want it from this person, this is how I have to do it, which is fascinating too.
And that's that 9-month tribal knowledge learning that you get, and it takes you figure that after that 9-month or year period. I wonder if like leaders, and maybe they already do, are going to have sort of not just perhaps executive assistants, but sort of PR people who are very attuned to messaging so that they can still lead without having to think about the distribution of that message as things get more complicated.
Tragically, and I don't know what Kimberly's thought is on this, but tragically, I think human beings will revert to mean. Human leaders will revert to mean unless they're intentionally thinking about this. And so I think for entry-level employees, we're going to revert to large language models, which we euphemistically call AI, to hire and fire people because it's just easier and impersonal.
Are you saying they're not really intelligent, Jesan? Is that what you meant by that with that euphemism comment?
Tell you what, you have me back on the podcast. We'll talk about intelligence. Anyway. And then for the much put upon middle manager, those individuals will probably, if they are to be let go, it will be whatever method they choose because there'll be so fewer of them. It'll be easier to deal with them. So I suspect that'll be email, in person, TikTok videos, tweets, whatever, however you're going to get them out. And then upper management will always be hands-on. Mm-hmm. It'll always be a George Clooney up in the air. I've got to show up to fire the CEO in person kind of deal, or to deliver a message that the CEO needs to hear. And I think that's the tragedy of sort of the nature of hierarchies in organizations. And unfortunately, there's no emotional or material or even financial impetus to do better at the bottom. And that's part of the reason why I do the work that I do is to create that impetus to do better at the bottom, because that's where your future leaders are going to be coming from.
Are there? Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask about the hierarchy thing. Are there any other implications on language and how we communicate with each other with the fact that there's the hierarchy structures? What does a hierarchy impose upon our ability to communicate? And what are some low-hanging fruit thoughts on that? Anything?
Kimberly, go ahead.
Well, I would say just one additional thought. So I know a huge focus that I'm aware of is how do we teach, especially new leaders, how to communicate, in part because they are the funnel for the leaders that are going to come. And I think I think that's still something we need to double down on, even though AI is coming. And my biggest fear is what's going to happen is they're going to get like they're just going to cut and paste things. And the communication isn't going to, it's great that this AI can create this beautiful message for you, but it's going to be very impersonal. And in the sense that
not authentic, you're
going to cut and paste it. And so you think it's going to, again, you're going to think you've done something when the truth is you really haven't done what you thought you've done. So I do think we still have to teach people how to have empathetic communication, particularly if you're talking about leaders. I don't care where along the line they are, because
probably more so now even than before.
If you get them in the beginning, then they only grow that skill set as they go. My thought about the hierarchy of, when you talk about hierarchy of organizations, like my first thought was most C-suites have their own communication team. And so they have someone who is paid to create their comms for them so that they can usher it out the way you want. But I don't find that many companies have a great means. Like, I get it, they have all the tools. So like, you can communicate with your team, you can communicate across teams. But when you talk about going up that pyramid, I don't necessarily find the funnel is very open in most companies. It's very filtered what the upper level actually hears. And then again, the filter down is, I'll use healthcare as an example. Majority of those employees are on the floor treating patients. They're not sitting at a desk looking at their inboxes. So so how you communicate. So if you're just pumping out emails or whatever, there's a large probability that they're never going to see that communication. And so you knowing your audience becomes so important.
I agree. I think the great workplace classic Office Space provides us with some information here.
So good.
Did you? Yeah. Oh, so good. So much better than the show The Office. And yes, all y'all can come for me now. That's fine.
I agree with you 100%. I love that movie.
We should all have some flair.
Yes.
Oh my. And 34 pieces and not one piece less. I think you're in I think, Kimberly, to answer your question, it's a situation where, again, just like in that film, we've got we're going to have a whole dynamic of middle of the hierarchy individuals. And again, you're seeing this with the return to work thing that's happening right now, dynamic that's happening right now. Middle managers having to justify their existence based on the level of in-person interaction that they have with individuals around things that could have probably been done via email. And I know we just talked about how you've got to pick the medium to send the message, but it works the other way too. It works in all aspects. So if we're using, to Dan's point, right? If he's doing an initiative where some people are going to be fired, he probably needs to deliver those, not him, but his committee needs to make a plan for people to deliver those types of messages in person, right? Now, that doesn't apply for the TPS reports, though, that didn't get filled out. That could have been an email. And that, of course, was the whole frustration of the individual and the guy in Office Space. And so I think that the low-hanging fruit there, to Kimberly's point, is how do we train or how do we develop younger leaders, not only in the empathetic nature of communication and the need to engage in empathy in communication, but how do we train the middle manager to recognize the need to support that empathy when there may be no impetus to do so? I think that's another piece of low-hanging fruit there that we can probably pluck.
Yeah. And I think, and just to put another point on an additional point on the hierarchy question, I think because there's so many there's legal issues, there's HR issues, there's all these layers of things that you become more constrained by the higher up in an organization you go, that I think that makes communication. You have to be very careful with how you communicate, because if you're a lower level manager and you say something off the cuff, it's like, Dan said that. But if the president of the college says something, everyone's like, what? And there's a cascade effect by even the slightest word that is misinterpreted,
Well, that's why they have a team.
That's why yeah, no, for sure.
And is
and
that how it should? Is that a consequence? Is that a consequence that is legit? Or are you suggesting that shouldn't be that way, or is there something to be addressed in there?
I think it is. I don't think it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's just if you're on the bottom level of the rungs, you're looking up and seeing that behavior. It gives you a sense-making tool as to why that's happening. I'm not going to get a super authentic message from certain people in the organization because they can't really do it, because they're constrained by different things. Whereas if you're in a middle management position, you have a little more freedom to speak freely and be a little more authentic in your communication. But that doesn't mean I don't think executives shouldn't strive for that. And I think some people are very good at it and still being authentic and expressing themselves. But I definitely think, and I guess back to the points that are overall being made, training needs to go into how to be an authentic communicator when you're going through the ranks, and you have those skills once you're in the executive level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've got a great story. So we talked about firing. Email goes out. Okay, we're gonna say this character we're gonna talk about. We're gonna call him Robert Oppenheimer because he was an employee who was kind of explosive, right? So, email comes out from Robert Oppenheimer's manager, says, "I need to let everyone know Robert Oppenheimer's no longer with us." That's it. What do you think happened to Robert Oppenheimer?
Oh, he's fired.
Oh, I think he sent back an email quoting the Bhagavad Gita. Behold, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Died. Like, Robert's no longer with us. Did he die?
Well, I mean, I don't know. So in your experiences, like I know in certain companies, you can tell the difference if someone quit or if someone got fired because there's language that they use when they were let go.
Oh, yeah.
Now they don't say that, but there's coding, like it's in there. And
Joe's spending more time with his family. I have literally seen that in an email. Joe decided he was going to spend more time with his family.
He's exploring,
for sure.
He's exploring external opportunities.
I love that one.
I have also seen it, and this is it's becoming common too, as just not saying anything at all. And like somebody's gone, you don't know if they got fired, you don't know if they quit, because there's no notices going out about change in personnel. And it's like, and then you get a kickback email saying so-and-so no longer works here. And you're like, what? No notice went out at all.
Yeah, but that sends a message in and of itself.
Oh, yeah.
If nothing is said.
Yeah, trust. That's a trust thing all of a sudden. You start not having faith in the communication structures and systems as the veracity of things being said or not being said.
Well, because then the question becomes, well, why did you announce some but not others? So what's really going on?
What are you hiding? What are you not going to hide? What do I know and not know?
And then immediately you start having a culture problem because people start to assume something nefarious has happened, something very negative has happened.
100%.
Or they're hiding something. And that I've seen that happen where you can have a completely stable environment suddenly derail simply because you did not communicate. And for whatever reason, but boy, it starts a skid that is then hard to stop.
Yeah, well, nature abhors a vacuum, and so people are going to backfill their vacuum with whatever stories they are going to tell themselves about whatever is happening inside of the situation. And most of those stories are going to be based in the three most corrosive types of communication in an organization: gossip, rumor, and innuendo. And so, you as a leader have a responsibility to fill that space. And if you don't even recognize that the space needs to be filled, that's a bigger issue. That needs to be that potentially needs to be addressed. I'd like to double back for just a moment because there's something that occurred to me when we were talking about the hierarchy piece. I think the communication piece works differently at scale. So Kimberly was talking about C-suite teams that have PR teams. Absolutely, for sure, have a communications director. Great. Those Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, the places where the CEO is making $50,000 a month, and has stock options, right? And is like the president of a small country. Cool, right? We work a lot with small and medium-sized business organizations. Those organizations don't have PR teams.
Right.
If you're a family organization, if you're an organization with up to maybe 2,500 people somewhere in there, you typically are not going to have a PR team. And so understanding that scale is the thing that defeats us with communication is also something very critical to keep in mind as well.
It's huge. It's a huge
one. I think it's a really excellent point.
Yeah.
I do have a question, though. Is gossip always bad?
I say it is.
Kimberly, I'll let you take this
really?
one.
No,
I would disagree. I don't think gossip's always bad.
Well, say more about that. Why do you think? Wait, tell me when you think gossip is good.
I think gossip it's a way of entering the culture. It gives you the inside scoop about what's potentially really going on if you're gossiping with the right person.
Define gossip, I guess.
Well, sharing information about things that are happening at the institution that might not be official, that might not be being said officially, but behind the scenes, this is what's really going on, and sharing that kind of information. I think gossip sometimes.
So wait. Gossip
can be positive.
Unofficial communication of a negative nature.
It could be negative. It could be positive. It could be anything. It could be just is. But it's information that's not necessarily official. Not everybody might be privy to, but it could be advantageous to know. Like, all right, so say, getting back to communication, I'll give an example. Say, like, there's an employee who, if you email them, they will never email you back. Don't even bother waiting for the email. That would be a very low, minor level piece of gossip that you might share with somebody.
I don't know what you guys. That's not gossip.
No. Well, I'm just trying to give an example. I mean, or this person potentially, we're talking about firing. This person probably got let go for these reasons. These things are the things that were happening in their unit that potentially may have caused the door to open for them.
I'm gonna pause you there.
I would classify that. I would classify that as innuendo or rumor.
Yeah,
more so than gossip.
And I'm going to say this. No, I'm going to let you guys respond. I just want a final point. Yeah. I feel like saying is gossip good is like saying is evil good. And then what I mean by that, gossip is by definition.
Yeah, is by harming somebody, though.
I'm just saying. All I'm saying is
you're saying gossip. I'm going to spread a nefarious rumor about Jodah, right? Throughout the organization.
I'm just saying that gossip is by definition. I'm not talking about that. No. I'm just saying that by definition. All I'm going to say is that by definition, gossip I think is bad. That's by definition. And if you're doing side conversations,
and I'm going to argue that it's not always bad. It can be bad if I'm going to spread a nefarious rumor about Jodah. Then gossip is bad. But if it's just sharing information and speculating about the players,
okay, all right. Well, Kimberly, Jesan, what
different definition?
What do you guys think? What you decide this, and Dan and I will stop wrestling.
I was simply going to say it depends on your objective.
That's what I'm saying.
So if you're trying to create a healthy cultural environment where, there's transparent, open communication and all that kind of stuff, gossip can be absolutely detrimental because it seeds a lot of like cattiness and, backstabby things and like, well, I heard and oh my God. And did you hear about that? Like, so it's the water cooler at its worst, basically. It's using an office phrase that probably most people don't even know what that means anymore. But the idea of like how people are very, from a leadership standpoint, do I think gossip's good? No. If your objective, though, is you are trying to create some clique or you're trying to socially embed yourself with some people at work that are that, then your objective is going to be go do that. Then you're going to be like, yes, I'm going to be the gossip. I'll be gossip girl. I'll be gossip queen. It depends on your objective of what you want to use that gossip for. But in general, do I think gossip's good for the health of to create a healthy team culture? No. Do I know that it exists in every single team I've ever been on? Yes.
Yes, it is. It's a natural thing.
We didn't say it's not. Jesan, what's your take?
So I have three thoughts here, as you could probably imagine. I have more, but I'll distill it down to three. So first thought, gossip is a natural. It is a part of human anthropological and cultural context, particularly for how we socially norm each other, right? How we make sure that everybody stays in line in the tribe. There's some clear research on this. You can go Google it. You can go look it up.
I've read it too, yes.
Yep, psychologists, anthropologists have been looking at this for a long time. Now, just because it is inbuilt into our culture, not necessarily our biology, but into our culture, does not make it necessarily an overall good. I do believe that our responsibility as leaders and honestly as purveyors of culture is to overcome our base natures. But that's just my opinion. That's one thought. Second thought is, as a leader, I often keep in mind, or I will tell leaders when the subject of gossip comes up, I will tell them of a president, probably the last really good president we had, who had a plaque on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." Guy named Harry Truman, right? Now, what is that socially signaling to the team in the White House? And what is that socially signaling to the nation about him as a politician, or quite frankly, as a statesman? Well, it's indicating that you can gossip all you want, but at a certain point, accountability stops somewhere. And I am the person where accountability stops. He was rapidly advancing the idea of accountability. You have less gossip when when more people in the organization are accountable than fewer people are accountable. Because when you feel accountable for your words and for your actions, all of a sudden you are now accountable for everything else. And thus you're not spreading gossip. Third thought on this, and this goes to Dan's point. Dan, most of us are not on Game of Thrones. Most of us don't have an 800-ton dragon. And that's what gossip is. It's an 800-ton dragon. And we all need to stop bowing up like we've got one. You don't. You don't have an 800-ton dragon. You're not in a fight to win, Westeros or something. You're trying to get paid and advance an agenda that you didn't pick. Let's be real here.
Oh, but
right?
come on. The backstabbiness is what makes the day worth doing, right? Because I'm
all
most
about
jobs are not that exciting. It's the gossip that keeps you coming back.
You should see the bloodbath behind him. It is gruesome. It's morbid.
Hey, I got a question, and this will really help me continue to amass my power at work. What about silence? Could you use silence to mass power as well? Like when people email you or ask you questions, you just don't respond.
That's not this Mac.
Isn't silence a powerful communicator too?
I'm going to say Machiavelli. I'm just going to drop Machiavelli on that one. And right, you are literally leveraging. It's a power move. That's all it is. It's a power move. Right. I mean, because even if you totally disagree and you're like, my silence is to communicate to you that the question is ridiculous, still the right thing is to respond to the question, right?
Well, it could also mean you just didn't see the email.
True.
I mean,
see them all.
I know people who would get hundreds of emails a day. Like, if you just want to assume silence, my initial assumption is you just never even saw the email.
Oh, I set my Outlook so I know that you opened the email and read it.
Oh, you're one of those. I got you pegged. Okay.
So what does that say?
No.
What does that say? What does that say about the person who does it?
No, but I think silence is still an answer. Now, the problem is, and this is where assumption comes in, is you're going to assume what that answer is, whether or not that's reality. So it could totally be a power play. It could totally be like, oh, I need to think about this, but I don't have time in this moment to think about this. So I'm going to get back to it. And maybe they forget to go back. Because it's that
vacuum that Jesan was talking about, though, right? I mean, they're going to be assuming a lot.
There could be so many reasons why there's silence, but we usually jump to the worst possible assumption of, oh my God, they hate me. They hate the idea. Or it's a power play. Whatever it is, people will fill that space with the worst story possible. And again, I think that's where we have to, one, it is a method of communication. And it can be very strategically used intentionally. But I also think we have to be careful with making assumption about what silence really means.
Well, and in America, I believe there are some studies that show, I don't think the recent one has been done because we live in a world of a cacophony of noise now. Yeah. But I believe the last thing that I saw was that the average person in the United States can only tolerate about 7 seconds of silence.
Oh, interesting.
It's very short. It's like our attention span. It's gotten much shorter.
Bingo. And I tie it to that, right? So in some of the work that I used to do, because I used to be in higher education like Dan, if I was in a judicial hearing meeting with a student and I would ask a question that I already knew the answer to, because I was also raised by lawyers, so those are the kinds of questions you ask when you're in those types of moments. And I already knew the answer. The student didn't know that I knew. And so, yes, on the one hand, it's a power move, absolutely, for sure. But on the other hand, it's also a move where I'm just waiting to see what they're going to fill the silence with. And by the way, police do this when they interrogate you. Mm-hmm. So if you're ever under police interrogation, hold out more than 7 seconds.
Well, and the same thing, coaching, silence is a very powerful tool because people can't stand it. I mean, it's the immediate gratification. What do you think texting is about? What do you think instant messaging is about? Is people can't stand the wait because they do not have the tolerance for the silence, whatever that, even if it's not true like silence, but they can't handle the wait for what they're expecting you to give them.
I think that's funny about messaging. The instant when we DM, it used to be you could DM and you didn't have to respond for a while, or you could even just not respond. DM was this sort of side communication. Today, if you don't respond to the DM within 15 minutes, 10 minutes, you're probably ignoring them. And it seems like that's the ethos that's out there now. It's like, you've got to respond right away, or why did
gets back to that medium thing, right?
The medium thing, it's how we've changed. The culture seems just probably maybe less so in business circles, but definitely in the world it seems that way.
I will, I'll say this in terms of the email thing. One thing I try to do now is just say, even because I think sometimes people don't respond and you get that silence because they don't know the answer to the question you've asked. And so just saying, hey, I don't know. I got to talk to some people and I'll get back to you in this span of time.
But you have to be confident to say you don't know.
So there's a lot of that.
I mean, if you were a leader with a fairly large ego, saying I don't know is like criminal. Like, you're never going to do that because it makes you look less than what you want to look in some people's eyes. So,
yeah, for sure.
That takes a level of confidence. I mean, I have no problem saying I have no clue, but I know some people I've worked with and for, those words will never come out of their mouths. Like, they want to be the authority. And if that question is coming to them, it's coming to them for a reason.
Right. But you could respond simply as saying, I mean, we're getting into specifics here, but you could just simply respond saying, hey, I see your message. Haven't had time to take a look at it. We'll check it out this week. Give me a couple
Getting
days.
into specifics. Jodah, you're always complaining that we're too esoteric on this show.
I know. And then on top of that,
shooting me down.
you gave me an idea that Microsoft should actually have a button that you can click, that when you click on it, it says, I seen this email. Doesn't mean I've read it, but I've seen it. And that way they know that you've seen it. And,
Yeah. Well, they'll come up with that tool and they won't pay us a dime. Thanks for sharing that intellectual property with
pending.
them,
It's a patent pending right now. What are you talking about? It's stated.
Follow-up question to this. Can you over-communicate? Do leaders need to think, we have silence, but what about the over-communicators?
Oh, yes, you can over-communicate. I've been beating myself up over the last couple of days because I've been oversharing. It's been ridiculous. Ridiculous.
Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to over-communicate?
Well, it means that you're not allowing the other party in the conversation to breathe because you're so needy of hearing your own voice.
Dan,
let me be self-aware. No, not Dan. Dan is fine. You're needy of hearing your own voice. That you're not allowing the other person to breathe in the room, right? Yeah. Or to paraphrase from Richard Dawkins, you're so in love with your own ideas that you're drunk with your own ideas. And just like an intoxicated person at a bar, someone needs to cut you off and tell you to go home. Right. It's time to leave. And so, I think about, I've been critiquing myself, and I do this in my own personal communications, business communications. How effectively am I communicating? How consistently am I communicating? Am I over communicating? And of course, we all know those people that we want to get the heck away from in a conversation because you can't get into a thought edgewise, much less a word.
So I have a very brilliant phrase for it, which has been used by others, but you said so many beautiful, intelligent things. So all I could think is when you say over communicate, verbal diarrhea, it's a lot less sophisticated than what he just said, but it's the fact that it's a ton of words. You're lost. You don't even know what they were talking about because they've said so many things. And so walking away, you have no idea what the objective was. You have no idea what you actually were supposed to take out of it, other than you're thoroughly confused. And yes, you're running away as quickly as possible. And hopefully you're not responsible for something because you could not for the life of you tell you what that would be. Because it was so jarbled and it was so much. I often feel like, who's really good at this? Politicians. Who don't really want to answer a question, but there's a ton of words in there, but gosh darn it, I can't tell you what any of them mean. Theoretically, they're all words they're somewhat
They
in a
say
decent order.
so much and nothing at the same time.
I think to me but I mean, you can also think, and I was thinking about this as well, when you're talking about the change you're going through, like a legitimate change. In those moments, can you over communicate? Some people would argue yes. I would say no. So like if you have a legitimate, concise, clear message and you know it's a big change of some kind, I think err on the side of over communication. From emails, whatever it is, billboards, pamphlets, whatever you need to do to get your message and ensure that message is being received. I don't think in that moment you can have over communication, but I do think
that's a good point.
If your message is not clear and it's not concise and you're just, wasting a lot of air because you love to hear yourself talk, I feel like that's a different thing. But definitely I think we all can think of people who do that.
And again, I don't think the example you gave is exactly over communicating. It would be qualified as appropriately communicating. Because I would
some
assume
people might feel like it's too much. Like I've had leaders say when we would go in with a communication plan and say, wow, this feels like too much. And we would say, I would rather err on the side of too much and then versus not enough. And so talking about leadership out there, or even like when you're having something necessary with a family, like if it's a clear, concise message, making sure it's covered is appropriate, but it's the clear, concise part is the key.
There's a model that we use in our in our training and development with leaders. We call it the 3 C's model, and I've talked about it a little bit on this podcast before, but it bears bringing up here because it goes to Kimberly's point about thinking and then communicating. So we often wind up in a word jumble because we are not thinking clearly. And that's an interesting question to ask leaders. And so the model that we use is the 3 C's model. We talk about clarity, candor, and courage, right? And the first C of that clarity is not merely clarity of speech. It is clarity of thought. Mm-hmm. And all speech communication starts in your brain until Elon Musk gets that, Neuralink hooked up, right? Until we're all Neuralinking with each other in the great singularity in the sky, or wherever on the earth, wherever it's going to be at. Until that happens, we need to think clearly in order to speak clearly. And many leaders and their followers are confused in their thinking. And that's probably a much larger issue with both undersharing and oversharing.
Well, and to circle this all the way back to something you said at the beginning when we started talking was, can you explain it to a 5-year-old?
Right.
Can you answer questions, at that simple of a level? And if you can't, then that's where you have to go back and say, okay, I need to make this clear. I need to think this through differently. Because again, attention spans are short. So if you can't communicate it very clearly, very concisely, you've lost them after the first 3 words.
Unless they're listening incredibly intently, but yeah.
Well, and realistically, most people are staring at their Apple Watches or their iPhone.
I'm doing that right now, actually. So yeah, you're right. So yeah. Hey guys, I am sorry to do this. We are actually at time here. So, but any final thoughts? Let's take 5 minutes here. Any final thoughts before we close this out?
What are your key takeaways around communication and leadership?
So I'll jump first. I think that the clear takeaway from our conversation today is that communication can happen anywhere at any time. It happens whether we're paying attention to it or not. It involves a lot of different aspects of thought and of communication, right? That we sometimes take for granted, sometimes don't think through all the way, and can sometimes rely too much on our tools rather than our relationships and our connections with other people. And all of those need to be examined by leaders who are communicating intentionally with their brains on. And we need more of that, not less of that.
Nice.
I would say yes to that completely. I also think what I would encourage for people to do is to proactively try to improve those skills. And so if you think you're a good communicator, I would ask your team. So in a training I used to ask leaders, the first thing I would say, are you a good communicator? And overwhelmingly, everyone would say yes. And then the next question I would ask is, would your team describe you as a good communicator? And the answers were always very different. And so then this was them imagining themselves. And they were like, oh, well, I don't know. So what I would encourage leaders to do is to get curious about where they can get better. Don't become defensive about it if you get some criticism about your communication. That's actually a gift, because if you want to continue to promote and move up in your career, communication is going to be critical along that journey. Because it's that whole concept of, it takes forever to build trust. It takes one action to break it. And usually it comes through something that you've done via communication. So I would just really encourage people to seek out really great mentors, seek out coaches, ask for that help proactively. Don't wait for it. Hopefully don't wait till you're told you suck at something to get better at it. Because I don't know a single person who's a perfect communicator. Everybody has some aspect that they can work on and focus on. And just keep in mind that it's not just about your words, it's also your actions. Your actions are incredibly important. How you behave, how you show up is equally as important as the words you use.
And my key takeaways, I'm going to use more silence and gossip to amass power so I can completely take control of the organization for which I work.
Thanks for letting me know.
That's what I'm going to do. Did I tell you about Jodah?
Oh wait, are we going to tell that? Are we going to get? Can I divert again? No. Are we going to do that? Do we want to tell the story of our college friend, or should we just
the erectile dysfunction story? Yes, let's sandwich the episode with erectile dysfunction stories.
It ends with this, and Sam's accent, and like I said, it really does not relate to the story you said, other than it has to do with erectile dysfunction.
He called me Sam. This is blonde-haired friend.
Dan. So we had a friend, we had a mutual friend in college, and he was a Japanese foreign student, and awesome dude. Hung out with us, and he came to us one day. He told us his story because he was aware of what had happened, and he was in class, and the teacher it was politics class, I think, and the teacher said to him, he asked the class, he goes, "Oh, tell us, what do you think if America had one problem with its political system?" Or what would it be? Just what's the biggest problem? Every student, students rose their hand, and then I think it wasn't Taro, but anyways, our friend raised his hand, and with a very thick Japanese accent, he told everybody that we have an erection problem.
Well, that's another kind of communication challenge.
It is. That's why I was remiss to even tell the story.
As we become a more international workforce, appreciating how difficult other languages are to master, and
absolutely,
enunciation can be difficult.
Totally. Yeah. Dan, thanks for having me say this story.
We should say this was probably right after the Gore versus Bush election.
Yeah, probably.
No, this was back in the 90s, so maybe not. No. He was talking about elections.
No, it was probably. No, Gore.
Anyways, we should wrap up.
Yeah. Take us out, Dan.
Anyways, how can folks find, not that they're going to want to find you after this joke that Jodah just said, or story that Jodah just said, but if people want to reach out to you, how do they find you and hire you as consultants?
You can find me on my website, KimberlyJBenoit.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn by the same name. And I would just love to chat with anybody. Lord knows I've given you ample reason to have conversations with me after today. So I'm sure all my devices have been listening, and I'm going to get a bunch of erectile dysfunction ads on my phone. So, but yeah, that's how you can find me.
Hey, son.
And of course, this is now my third time on the Census Signal podcast. And so thank you, gentlemen, for having me back again. It's always a good time.
It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Always a good time showing up here. As usual, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in Jesan M. Sorrells, and you will be able to connect with me there from the Census Signal podcast. I would also encourage you to take a listen to the podcast that I host. It's called the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, where we read a great book that you fell asleep to in high school and try to pull out leadership lessons from it. Sense and Sensibility, Hamlet, Thus Spake Zarathustra, The Brothers Karamazov, and more. You can check that out on Apple, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or everywhere where you listen to podcasts. And finally, check out my latest book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere where you pick up books. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, you both are wonderful guests. It's always lovely to have you both on the show. On the show.
Thank you.
And we'll have you on again sometime.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
See you guys later. See you next time.
See you later.
Bye.